Sometimes the media ignores stories or refuses to report the truth or seems biased. And I wanted to go back to the 1930s to a perfect example of how Western media refused to report the truth and millions died because of it. There are atrocities that shock the world because they're seen. There are atrocities that succeed because they're not. The Holodomor was a man-made famine that killed millions of Ukrainians, and it belongs firmly to the second category. Not because it was hidden completely, not because information didn't exist, but because much of the Western media chose not to tell the truth, even when the truth was available. This isn't a story of ignorance, it's a story of how access, ideology, fear, and professional failure. Between 1932 and 1933, Soviet Ukraine was devastated by a famine that was not the result of drought, crop failures, or natural disaster. It was caused by deliberate policy. Grain requisitions, forced collectivization, sealed borders preventing peasants from fleeing, punishments for villagers that failed to meet quotas. Food existed, but people starved anyway. Millions died, not quietly, not instantly, but slowly, publicly, and in full view of the state. And yet at the time, much of the Western press told readers something very different. Western newspapers in the 30s used phrases like food difficulties, temporary shortages, exaggerated reports from hostile sources. The dominant message was simple: things were hard in the Soviet Union, but claims of mass starvation were overblown. This wasn't accidental, it was editorial. The Soviet Union understood something very early on: control access and you control the story. And foreign correspondents were restricted to major cities, monitored constantly, and dependent on visas that could be restricted overnight. So journalists played along to keep access. Those who didn't were expelled. And you've got to remember, this is the time of the Great Depression. Capitalism looked shaky. Fascism was rising in Germany and Italy. The Soviet experiment fascinated Western intellectuals who'd always had a softness for the Marxists. So uncomfortable facts were treated with suspicion. They didn't want the Soviet Union to fail, certainly not catastrophically. So reports from diplomats were softened. Starvation just didn't fit the story they wanted to tell. Perhaps the most infamous phrase was "there is no famine," and that sentence appeared repeatedly in Western newspapers. It reassured readers, it legitimized silence, and it was entirely false. Not a mistake, not premature, just entirely false. There were journalists who tried to tell what happened. Some journalists travelled illegally, spoke to refugees. Some even wrote what they saw, and they described villages without children, people collapsing in the street, bodies left unburied. And their reports were accurate, but they were marginalised. Editors questioned their credibility. Other journalists attacked them publicly. They were accused of sensationalism, bias, even warmongering. Truth was treated as irresponsibility. And why didn't the governments push back? Because they knew more than they admitted. Well, diplomatic cables described famine conditions clearly, and intelligence assessments were blunt. But acknowledging the famine posed problems as well. It complicated trade negotiations and undermined diplomatic recognition. It risked confrontation, so silence became the policy. Media caution aligned neatly with state interest, and millions died. But don't worry, Western audiences were reassured. The Soviet government faced little external pressure, and the famine continued uninterrupted, because they could have stopped it at any point. What turned into a genocide required global silence. Walter Duranty of the New York Times repeatedly assured Western audiences there is no famine. He acknowledged food shortages. He admitted suffering, but he denied mass death. This was false. He knew it was false, and private correspondence confirmed it. Yet his reporting dominated Western understanding because he had access, spoke with confidence, and he reassured editors and governments alike. Gareth Jones travelled illegally to Ukraine, and he spoke to starving villagers who reported plainly what he saw. He said millions were dying, but as he was attacked by fellow journalists, accused of exaggeration, portrayed as irresponsible. Journalism turned on those telling the truth, not because they were wrong, but because it was inconvenient. To suggest that the Marxists could be failing and deliberately murdering millions of people just didn't fit the worldview. It was inconvenient. And journalism became a guild of protection rather than searchers. In fairness, a lot of Western outlets didn't lie outright. They used language instead. Instead of engineered starvation, they said food difficulties. Instead of mass death, they said hardship. Instead of state policy, they said unfortunate outcomes. They linguistically downgraded what was happening, and language shaped the moral response. If something's framed as complex, temporary, or ambiguous, urgency dissolved. This wasn't neutral wording, this was ethical laundering of Stalin. Soviet denials were given equal or greater weight than refugee testimony. One side controlled borders, grain, police, and prisons, while the other died in the. Western governments never had to censor the press. You could argue that the press anticipated state interest because they recognized that the famine would complicate diplomatic recognition or disrupt trade or force more moral positions governments didn't want to take. But media caution aligned perfectly. Was it just that they couldn't accept the Soviet Union could be so harmful? Because we look another time at what happened when the Soviet Union attempted to take the whole of Europe. Yes, there was a war where Lenin attacked the whole of Europe. We just forget it because he didn't get very far. But the Western media lined up to spout his side of the story. And the Soviet Union was given a pass while they committed a genocide with impunity. There were no sanctions, there were no mass diplomatic pressure, there was no meaningful humanitarian intervention. The famine just ran its course, largely because of journalists who didn't want to upset paradigms that fit their. This whole instance shows us how privileged access trumps evidence. The powerless can be discredited, influential liars protected, and moral clarity can be neutralized through language. Complicity by a myth. Perhaps we should watch out for when they say we must be careful, when journalists say it's too early to conclude, or when they say both sides deny the claim. In the face of overwhelming asymmetry, it might just be repeating the same ethical mistake. The Holodomor isn't just a genocide against Ukrainians and a crime against humanity. It's a permanent indictment of media ethics under pressure. How easy it is to sweep the truth under the carpet when it's. And there's plenty of authoritarian states today who are able to dominate and twist debate on a large range of topics through useful idiots and paid media. And mainstream media who just want